The subject of troubleshooting reminds me of conversations I've had with my kids when they were younger, when they were getting ready to drive. They'd say things like, Dad, driving is easy. You just steer and put your foot on the gas or the brake. And you know what? They're right. Once you're driving down the road in your lane and everybody else is obeying the traffic rules, it is easy. But skills in driving come into focus when you get to a busy intersection. If when someone cuts you off, when you have to plan how to get off on a freeway exit and navigate busy streets, with someone honking behind you. It's really the same thing with running a show. If you're in the middle of a song, you can pretty much take your hands off the wheel, right? Maybe the lead singer, needs to come a little bit up in the mix and just push the fader up. A trained monkey can do that, right? But when you come to that analogy of a busy intersection, the transition between songs, when the presenter comes up to talk and the video feed needs to be ready for the next cue, and the background singer's mic feedbacks while the music director is trying to get your attention. That is when you earn your stripes. You think about it, there are many, many things that can go wrong. But before we look into any of the specifics, let's kind of look at the basics. Before we get bogged down into specifics, let's take a really high level view of this and look basically at where your problems will lie. They'll either lie in your pre-mixer, in other words, all of your inputs going into your mixer, or they'll come within your mixer, in other words, in some sort of settings that you haven't set correctly, or it'll come post-mixer in your outputs. So let's just take an example like this. Let's imagine that you hear everything coming through the speakers, maybe not everything, maybe you hear something coming through your speakers, but maybe you don't hear a keyboard or you don't hear a bass guitar or something like that. If you hear something coming through your speakers, then you know that your post mixer is good. The line coming from your mixer into the amp is good. The amps are good. The line coming from the amps into your speakers are good. Everything post mixer is good. And so therefore you might want to look at things either before, in other words, how are things plugged in on the stage? How are things plugged into the mixer, or what's going on in your settings within your mixer? That's where you zero. Don't look at anything post-mixer if you hear something coming out of those speakers. Now, conversely, if you hear nothing coming out of your speakers, then why the heck would you look at anything on the stage or anything plugged into your mixer? Your problem is coming in post that mixer, coming in after that. So check out your speakers, your cables that go from that, your amp, and also your settings as well there. So once you have a really crystal clear understanding of signal flow, you can make informed guesses as to where those problems lie. If you don't hear a keyboard from the stage, I start at the keyboard. So is it working? Is it powered on? Is the cable coming from the keyboard a known good cable? Is it going into a known good DI box? Basically, you start from the source and then you make deductions as you go along that signal path in a steady, logical fashion. So let's see some examples. So let's start off with, say, your standard kick drum mic that is plugged into an input box, which then goes through some sort of snake, either an analog copper snake or a network cable that gets connected into a mixer. So where are the points of failure here, and where do you start? Now, if I'm going to drum this into your head, I'm going to drum this into a lot of times. You start with the source. So go over to that microphone. And is it a good microphone? Now, I know this microphone is a dynamic mic and it doesn't have a switch, but if it was any other microphone, maybe a vocal mic or something like that, some vocal mics, like some of the SM58 or something like that, they actually have physical switches. Is the switch turned on? If it's a condenser mic, does it have a fresh battery, or are you supplying it phantom power? All of those things happen right at the beginning before you even go any further. Now, once you know that that's a good microphone, and if it's a condenser mic, it has power and it's all good, then you move on and say, how's that cable? Is that cable connected correctly to from the microphone into the input box? Is it plugged into the right input on the input box? And then and only then you move on to that snake that goes out to the console. And then you look at the back of the console and say, is that plugged in correctly? There's a lot of situations where there's a bunch of volunteers and people just start unplugging things and plugging things in the back of a mixer. So make sure that that cable is plugged in correctly. And then there's an extra level here in terms of settings. Is that physical input on the back of your mixer being assigned to the right channel? We didn't have to worry about this in analog mixers. The input quarter-inch or XLR just went to channel 1. There was no fancy routing, but in a digital mixer you'll need to make sure that routing is good. So moving on to a setup where you have a wireless microphone. A wireless microphone basically transmits and goes to a receiver, which is plugged into an input box, which then goes into your mixer. So where are the points of failure? Think about it. And where do you start? You start at the wireless microphone, right? This is the transmitter, and the first thing to think of is it turned on? There's typically a switch on there, and quite often there'll be a power switch and maybe a standby switch on there, so make sure they're both on. One powers it up, the other one might mute it, so make sure that that's turned on. And then, and only then, do you move on to that receiver. And you'll need to check things like making sure they're on matching frequencies. And then you can actually just start talking to the microphone, and quite often you'll be able to see that there's some sort of signal on that display in the receiver. Some receivers may even have a headphone jack so that you can plug headphones in and you can hear whether it's going on. Now, if you're getting signal going to that, then and only then you start moving on to the input box, and then making sure that's plugged in correctly, and then that's plugged in correctly on the back of the mixer, and then finally those settings within that digital mixer. So we've looked at a wired microphone, we've looked at a wireless setup. Now let's look at things that just physically get plugged in through, say, a DI box. So from this example, we have a keyboard. Where do you start? You start off at the keyboard. Is the keyboard turned on? Is the volume turned up? Is the local switch on the keyboard? All of those things. Say if it was a guitar, has the guitar, if it's got a preamp built in, does it have a fresh battery? Is it plugged in? All of those things. So start off with the source, and then you go into the cable. Is the cable okay? Then is the DI box okay? Swap it out with a known good DI box. Is the cable that goes in the input box good? Is that okay coming into the back of the mixer? And finally, are the settings on the back here. So wherever you are, just keep on moving through from source to through to the mixer to check whether any of those points are the points of failure. So we've looked at examples of a wireless system, a wired microphone, and DIs here. And I've kind of taken the exceptionally logical approach from source to end. And if you've got time to do that, then I would really recommend you going in a methodical way there. But if you're rushed for time, here are the places that I tend to look if I'm rushed for time. The places where things tend to fall apart a lot, especially if you have a bunch of volunteers that are plugging things in and unplugging things in. Look at the input box and look at the back here. Here's where a lot of your problems will be. So let's look at a little bit more of an advanced troubleshooting here and see if you can follow along here. So we have a hi-hat plugged into our mixer, and then we are sending monitors back on stage. And the person on stage is saying, hey, I can't hear hi-hats on stage. But you know what? I hear everything else. Now, if they hear everything else but no hi-hats, you know that everything's good in terms of their in-ear monitors. There's no need to worry about pulling out batteries or checking the frequency or anything like that. You know that's all good. You know your transmitter is good because they hear those hi-hats. You know that line going out to that transmitter is good. So everything post-mixer is good. They're just not hearing hi-hats. Now, let's imagine that everybody else here hears hi-hats. And you know what? You hear hi-hats through the front of house speakers. You know from that microphone is good, that line is good, everything is good. So you know everything coming into the mixer is good. Everything going out of the mixer is good, except that on-stage performer is not hearing that in their in-ear monitors. And guarantee you that means that everything pre and everything post is good. It's definitely going on inside the mixer, and that aux send on that hi-hat is not turned up.